Welcome to the On List. Today we're talking about the Gentleman's Collection by Aramis, released in 2009. This is not one fragrance. This is 6 fragrances, although it is technically 8 fragrances if we're talking about the European release. So those of you guys in Europe who are like, hey, wait a minute, there's 8 of those, not 6. Sorry, us guys in America didn't get the other 2 releases. I can explain that in a minute if you'll hold on to your pants, okay? Just sit tight, right? Don't get them all in a twist, not just yet. The Gentleman's Collection is not something that we'll see again because the current cultural climate of the fragrance buying public is all about novelty and trend. So these days, we only want to wear what's hot. And really by that, I mean what's hot right now. So the moment something isn't hot anymore, you've outgrown it. And it's time to get rid of it. And I'm throwing a bit of shade on some of my friends here, but I've already seen the reels and the shorts, and I know that they constantly evaluate and reevaluate their fragrance choices based on how popular or current in their style that they seem to be. And in some cases, this means getting down less than a quarter of the bottle. It's not even 25% down, and they're already thinking, I need to replace this because it's not hot anymore, it's not current, it's not trending, people aren't impressed by it, it doesn't pull numbers on social media, whatever. That sickness could be the subject of a whole different video, but not a perfume video, right? That'd be more of a social psychology video, and I'm not really qualified to make those. But back in 2009, things were a bit different. Younger people were actually interested in older forms of culture because we had a bit of a retro boom in the 2000s. Those of you who were like me in your 20s back then know that in the 2000s we had all kinds of things. We had retro music like garage rock bands such as the Strokes, the Hives. We had a lot of the rebirth of what we now call vaporwave, the synth pop from the 80s coming back into vogue. We also had retro style cars like the Mini Cooper was first relaunched. We had the PT Cruiser from Chrysler. We had the new Beetle. Ford did a Thunderbird that was like the one from the 50s. People were getting back into vinyl again. That 70s show was very popular. Folk was making a comeback. People were just in general interested in revisiting the past or exploring a more timeless sense of culture, a post-modern culture where things of both now and then are kind of combined. So it's a different time, but it was a very ripe time for brands of all walks to revisit older things and relaunch them for a newer audience to explore. Which is why we won't see that ever again, because we don't live in a time that values that sort of thing, right? These days, people look back at a bottle of Sauvage, which is barely 10 years old, and go, oh, that's outdated now, I can't have that, right? Like, okay, 2015, was that long ago? I mean, all right, sure. Waste your money. It's your money to waste, not mine. I still have my bottle of Sauvage from 10 years ago. It's up there in the cabinet. I've used maybe that much of it, but I've still got it. You know, you can probably fault me for still having it more than you can for trading it out, I guess, in that case. But the Gentleman's Collection was, simply put, a way for Estee Lauder to respect that people wanted some of their old stuff. Both the old guys who missed the fragrances and young guys who are curious about them, right? So whether you are someone who is open to reinterpretation or someone who is a stick in the mud and only wants the first version of everything, deep vintage, first bottle, or it ain't real, that whole thing, right? I think everyone can agree no matter how pedantic or double down you are on the good times are behind us, whatever your cynical worldview is, everyone can agree that the Aramis collection, the gentleman's collection of Aramis, rather, was special in that it was one of the rare times that a brand the size of Estee Lauder acknowledged that there is still demand for their older products. Even if the demand is not huge, there is still enough demand that it warrants satisfying that demand. Right? Nowadays, if you can't sell 1 billion bottles in 6 months, it's gone. Right? There is no, oh, you only sell 5 million bottles a year? That's still 5 million fucking bottles. That's not good enough. Discontinued. Right? It comes out. Doesn't make ham over fist. And yes, I'm saying that on purpose, not hand. Ham over fist. Right? Because it's ham amounts of money we're talking here. Okay, ridiculous. So it was a portmanteau. All right. But if it's not making obscene gobs of money in a short period of time, it is ruthlessly taken out back and old yellered, right? It's why we see YSL putting out flankers like Blue Electrique, and literally it's on shelf for mere months. Months. I didn't even get a chance to smell that fucking fragrance before it was already discontinued. So that is the runaway diesel engine that is current trend obsessed sales, right? And if you know what a runaway diesel engine, you know it revs up and revs up and revs up and eventually it explodes. Well, we're not there yet, but we're seeing smoke. Let me tell you, we're seeing the smoke. So things are about to go down. My niche apocalypse video is basically when the engine blows. That video details that. But we are still in the rev up stage. We haven't hit kaboom yet, but we're close. We're very close to it. 2009 was a different world though. So, like I said, whether or not you like their formulations, I think everyone can agree that the collection is special because it gave that nod. And it was a second lease on life for many of these. And in some cases, I feel like these perfumes became more popular with the collection than they did on their first run-through, right? Because the first run-through for many of them was 40 plus years ago, and there wasn't internet, and there wasn't social media, and people didn't talk. So a lot of these fragrances hit shelves, and there was nobody there. Unless you caught a magazine ad, or you caught someone testing it and giving it to you to smell. A lot of these hit the market, and it was crickets. So when they were reissued in 2009, people are connected. They're on their smartphones. They're on the internet. They talk. These fragrances got a second chance to prove they were good all along. And I think that makes the collection special. And I think everyone can agree on that. Regardless of their stance on the actual formulas in the bottles, they can agree that it was a good opportunity for these fragrances to shine. Now, on to the individual fragrances themselves. I have done long-form videos on JHL, which is part of this collection, and I've also done a long-form video on a perfumer who has done about half of this collection. Bernard Chant is a perfumer, and if you want to watch those videos, they're from season 2023 and 2024, respectively. Season 2023 for the JHL video, and season 2024 for the Bernard Chant video. I may do future videos where I go deep dive on individual perfumes, but can't fit all that into 30 minutes. So this is just a quick once over the collection. Now, I can't really talk about the Aramis collection at all without bringing up the original Aramis from 1965. Technically 64. The first year was a soft launch in New York and London only, but it did so well that Estee Lauder spun it off into a separate division and relaunched it in 65. The different logo, different bottle. So those 64 bottles are rarer than hen's teeth, but they do exist. And they are technically Aramis by Estee Lauder rather than just Aramis. So the early year, the year one, the year zero bottle, whatever. So this came out in 65. and it sort of changed the world for a lot of men's fragrances because it was a big aldehyde, floral chypre fragrance. It is basically a mod of Cabochard de Grey by Parfum Grey. Perfumer Bernard Chant, IFF legend, he made Cabochard, and when he was contracted by Estee Lauder to make a men's fragrance, he didn't really believe in making men's fragrances in the way that most did, which is following wet shaver tropes, keeping it citrus and wood, keeping it lavender. He was very subversive. He felt like many women's fragrances could also be men's fragrances with a few subtle tweaks and marketing changes. And guess what, boys? Guess what? He was right. Because most of the things he put out that were for men were in fact just doppelgangers of women's fragrances he had previously released. And I've done a video about that. The video about him talks about that actually quite a bit. And this is, for all intents and purposes, Cabochard for men. Although I think Cabochard is actually more butch than Aramis because it's greener, more leathery, sharper. This is softer, more plush. If anything, this would be the women's version in my mind, but some of you are going to argue that, and it's fine. As long as you're polite about it, I don't really care. Now, the Aramis range was expanded in '73 due to the fact that Aramis was repositioned to be a male analog of Clinique. Clinique was launched in 1970 as a more spa-oriented brand of perfumes, and it did so well that Estee Lauder thought, hey, why not have a men's version of this concept? And Aramis, which at the time only featured the one fragrance, was expanded into a house. And thus in '73, we saw Chromatics, Basics, and the first of the Gentleman's Collection, 900. Herbal Eau de Cologne, released in 1973. Chromatics, haven't smelled, can't really talk about it. It didn't survive the '70s. And Basics, also haven't smelled, but I can tell you that Basics was more of a down market fragrance. Basics was meant to be a sort of Aqua Velva, Skin Bracer kind of analog, or Brute Old Spice competitor. And it was exclusive to Duane Reade. If you're in New York City, you know what Duane Reade is. It's kind of their local version of CVS, Walgreens. Kind of like how we had Bartell Drugs out here in Washington until recently. Rite bought them and destroyed them, but you know, Duane Reade got the Basics, and then the other two were kept in department stores. Well, only 900 survived of those three, and 900 was really a masculinization of Aromatics Elixir, released in 1970, the debut fragrance from Clinique. Another Bernard Chant composition, obviously. The big thing about the Aramis 900 is it was softened up and made muskier. So to me, it feels like he was trying to take the Aromatics Elixir structure and tug it towards an Eau Sauvage, Eau de Lancôme, Eau de Petou, Eau de Rochas. He was trying to pull it into that more fresh kind of cologne-y, for lack of a better word, that fresh cologne-y vibe. And Eau Sauvage was very popular, had a lot of jasmine in it, which was really odd for a men's fragrance at that time to have a big heavy jasmine dose. So you can smell that a lot of jasmine was put into 900. This is absent from Aromatics Elixir. So add jasmine, add musk, add citrus, tug the rose down a little bit, and push rose geranium up in its place. Just rebalance the levels and make a plusher, muskier, a little bit more transparent, softer, fresher version of Aromatics Elixir. And then put a bunch of herbs in it to qualify the name of Herbal Cologne. And bada bing, bada boom, you got 900, capiche. The Gentleman's Collection version is actually closer to that than the original bottles were. The original bottles were still a bit heavier on the patchouli, a bit heavier on civet, a bit heavier on the rose. They definitely feel closer to Aromatics Elixir than they probably should have been. The additional tweaks made to this formula actually bring it closer to a Eau de Guerlain, to a Trophy Lancôme, to a fragrance like that. And some of the deep vintage guys don't like that. They want it to be the heavier, greener, more obviously rose chypre, and I understand. I'm not saying that you're wrong for feeling that way. But by and large, the only reason why a lot of those older bottles are like that is the top notes weren't strong enough. They didn't go hard enough with the bergamot, with the jasmine, okay? They just didn't. And the passage of time has caused further wilting of those top notes. So they're even weaker now than they originally were, and they were already too weak. They're even weaker now. So it's less of a reformulation to modernize. Clearly this is not a modern fragrance. There's nothing modern about this, since every perfume I compared this to is from the 70s. And this is a newer bottle. Every perfume I'm comparing this formula to is from the 70s. It cannot be argued that this is a modern interpretation. You know, you would get backhanded across the balcony and down 3 flights of stairs into the dirt below, right? With that insolence of trying to call this modern. I mean, just like that. The big pimp hand grows 5 times larger and crackalax you because you're just abject moron state trying to say that this is more modern. It is, however, lighter, fresher, and more like a cologne-ish fragrance than maybe it originally was. And it does smell really much more like a Eau Sauvage, Eau de Guerlain kind of fragrance. So I think they were going for that in 73, but like I said, just weren't able to get there. They were going for that. And those older bottles, when you smell them, you can tell that's where they were headed. They just didn't quite get. And still the patchouli, you know, again, the oak moss, the really heavy rose, it's just too close to Aromatics Elixir. And I would just wear Aromatics Elixir than wear those old bottles of 900. And if you hate me for that, if you've got a dartboard with my face on it or whatever, or you're shooting tin cans with a BB rifle and you've got my face on one of them, that's fine, whatever. Just saying. Just saying it, just putting it out there, man. Just putting it out there. So then the next one up is going to be Devin. Devin from 1978. There's a little less to talk about on this one because this one's kind of a amalgamated mixture of things. This isn't really directly resembling one fragrance. Like Aramis 900, you can clearly tell it was Aromatics Elixir, just like the original Aramis was Cabochard. Devin was a bit more of a bash together kind of fragrance. You get bits of Azuré in here without the aldehydes. You get really more alliage sport scent than anything. And if you're really familiar with Estee Lauder's back catalog, if you're someone who loves Estee Lauder, you know Estee, you know alliage, you know Azuré, you know all that stuff, private collection, right? Then you will know, when you smell Devin, you will know that they basically went through the Lauder catalog and went like this. Take a bit of this, take a bit of that, take a bit of that, and they cobbled it all together and then shook it up. And then they gave you Devin. So it is at its core a leather chypre. So if you're someone who likes Jewels from 1980, if you're someone who likes Blend 30 by Dunhill from I think 78, if you're someone who likes Leonard Pour Homme, I think, or maybe it's the other one. Is it Pour Homme? Yeah, Leonard Pour Homme. You know, if you're someone who likes Polo, the original Polo from '77, okay, you'll get this fragrance. The big difference between this is that it has more noticeable castoreum than a Polo has, more noticeable galbanum than a Polo has. So this is somewhere in between a Polo and a Yatagan or a Jules. It's going to have the castoreum, the galbanum, the grassiness, but then it's going to have the oak moss, the little bit of tobacco accents. It's not going to be as heavy and mossy as a Polo, but it's also not going to be as leathery and herbal as a Yatagan or a Jules. So it sits somewhere in that middle road. And that's probably why it was not super popular, although I feel like more people, again, appreciate this now than they did back then, because nowadays you don't see stuff like this. 2009, this was niche, more or less. This was basically niche in 2009. So a lot of people's ears went like this when they smelled this stuff. And that can only be a good thing. That can only be a good thing. Next up, we have this one. I have a whole video dedicated to this one, so again, I'm not going to go at length about it, and it's really, honestly, as much as I've said about this, I don't really want to say more. Anyway, it's not really worth it. But the gist of this fragrance is Joseph Harold Lauder, JHL. He really enjoyed when his wife would wear the newly released Cinnabar, which was her clapback at Opium, which she claims was copying her Youth Dew. So really, Cinnabar was just Youth Dew with more spices. Really, it's what it was. Youth Dew with more spices. And that was her way of kind of combating the popularity of Opium by YSL, released in '77. And he liked the smell of Cinnabar so much, but wasn't going to wear it since it was not for men. So she went and reached out to Josephine Catapano, who created Cinnabar and Youth Dew, and asked her, hey, can you make like a men's version of Cinnabar for my husband to wear? And Josephine Catapano has never signed her name to a single man's fragrance up until that point. And she would not sign her name to another men's fragrance after that point. And in fact, she couldn't even do it on her own. She had to get Bernard Chant to help her, right? And you know, Bernard Chant is an expert at turning women's fragrances into men's fragrances. He's made a career out of it, more or less. So he absolutely came in there and helped her tweak the right knobs, pull the right levers, and turn Cinnabar into JHL. Now, JHL, ironically, smells closer to Youth Dew than it does to Cinnabar, because the changes he made, which were dial back the spices, dial up the musk, dial up the florals, make it softer, pull it back towards Youth Dew, which is hilarious. So once again, Cinnabar is the more butch fragrance, like with Cabochard being the more butch fragrance. The more manly, ambery, spicy, woody, heavy fragrance is Cinnabar. JHL is lighter, softer, more plush, more floral. And since we're talking about the Gentleman's Collection, this was the first one to get discontinued. In fact, when the regulations came through in 2011, only 2 years after the line launched, for whatever reason, they decided they couldn't reformulate JHL. So they just cut it. So JHL was back to being a unicorn again in no time flat. It was already a unicorn before, because it was a very limited release. When it finally came out in '82, 1 year before Harold Lauder's death, it went back to being a unicorn again, because the new release version of it was only on the market for a handful of years before being dragged back into the abyss. However, if you're a fan of the JHL and you don't want to pay that nasty $400, $500 ridiculous price, then I cordially invite you to get over yourself and just buy a bottle of this. I do. I cordially invite you to just get over yourself, right? Whatever your insecurities are, just deal with them. See a doctor, get on some meds. I don't care. Do what you got to do. And just walk into a Macy's and buy this for like almost nothing because they give this stuff away now. It's so good. You like musky, animalic chypres with a heavy amber base. You want that like faux Middle Eastern style. Well, guess what, honey? Sweetie? Estee Lauder was doing this way back in 1953. The kind of perfumery that you would get in an Amouage bottle and pay $400 for now was being done by a plucky New York socialite back in 1953. And here it is. Get over yourself and just buy this and then thank me later. And that's all she wrote. Next in line is going to be a lovely little thing that most of us Fougere fans know, called Tuscany Per Uomo. This one was released in Europe under the name of Etruscan, because I think a Tuscany already existed. They couldn't use that name for theirs. But this is probably one of the favorites of the collection for a lot of people, because it's very similar to Veil Pour Homme and Un Homme Charles Jourdan, and to a lesser extent also Azzaro Pour Homme from '78. A lot of people like to lock horns with Tuscany and Azzaro. I think they're different enough to not be redundant. I think you can safely have them both. The big difference is Tuscany Per Uomo has that anesthetic Fougere vibe that Azzaro has, but blends it with a chypre. So if you ever wondered what an Azzaro Pour Homme would smell like if it was crossed with a YSL Pour Homme, or just more labdanum, more oak moss, smooth it over, okay, make it really Mediterranean in vibe, as the name would suggest, a smooth customer this is, then this is what you want. And there was a scare. This was discontinued for a while, and it was a big scare. And I think it's discontinued again. I'm not sure. But it's the one that would shoot up in price whenever folks would get afraid that it was going away. Now, the next one in line is consequently, this is probably the least popular fragrance in the range, and it is 1988's New West. So this is a Harry Fremont composition, and you know I'm a big fan of his. This is one of the earliest fragrances to have a big, heavy Cologne melon note up top for men. There were previous ones, but for men, this was one of the first. So you get a very big honeydew, cantaloupe style melon note in the opening. Then it goes into a garrigue style herb melange, and then eventually it settles down on a chypre-like base of oak moss, of patchouli, okay, of sandalwood. So it's a bit more aggressive than some of the later aquatic fragrances that feature this note. And for that reason, it's one of my favorites. If you are a fan of Romeo Gigli Sud-Est, you would like New West. And this came out first in '88, like I said. And unfortunately, discontinued. So an alternative to this would be something a bit more popular and well-known, like Escape for Men by Calvin Klein. Could replace this. It's not as good a fragrance as this is, but it would do in a pinch. Now we have come to the last bottle in the American collection. There are two more in the European one, which I will talk about right near the end. But this is Havana, released in 1994, and perfumed by Nathalie Feistauer and Xavier Renard. This was a rejected formula for Tommy Cologne. That's really what it is. Rejected formula for Tommy Cologne, released as Havana instead. And when you smell it, you can understand why. This is a very sparkling, effervescent, Fugere-like tobacco bay rum scent. So if you like the idea of a rum and coke with lime, smoking a cigar, sitting in, well, Havana. If you like Cuba by Sheck and Speak. If you like Open by Roger and Goulet. If you like Montana Parfum Dome, if you like that, you know, all of those late 80s sort of tobaccos that played around with floral notes and rum notes, or big heavy doses of clove smoke like Open has. If you like that, you'll like this. And this was one of the fan favorites alongside Tuscany. Tuscany and Havana were the big fan favorites of this range. The others, not so much. JHL being the rare bird that it is, all the collectors love that one. But the people that actually use their fragrances prefer this and Tuscany over the others. So collectors just collect, right? Now, in Europe, we would see two releases from the 2000s that never saw release in Europe get tacked onto the collection. And they were Aramis Life and Aramis Always. Those bottles were still currently being produced in 2009 in the US, so there was no need to put them in the collection. But they never got launched in Europe, so Europe got them in those collection bottles. So if you're a European fellow, you'll have 8 fragrances: 900, Devin, JHL, Etruscan, New West, Havana, Life, and Always. We didn't get Life and Always here. We just got the first 6. That's it, guys. That's the Aramis Gentleman's Collection for you. Unfortunately, they were all discontinued at different points, but the last 2 being made were finally lopped off in 2019 or 2020 when the entire Aramis range was shuttered by Estee Lauder. That was the final nail in the coffin for all but the original Aramis fragrance, including all of the other brands they were making fragrances for, like Tommy Hilfiger and Zegna. Hopefully you learned something from this, and I will catch you in next